But when the HOA Karen decided to invade my private pool, I knew something had to change. It wasn't just a dip in the water. It was about control, power, and blatant disrespect. Each time I asked her to stop, the rules twisted in her favor, and soon I was buried in fines and threats. I'd had enough. But what I did next? It wasn't just about reclaiming my pool. It was about sending a message that no one, especially not someone like her, could walk all over me. What happens when the system that's supposed to protect you starts working against you? Stick around to find out. At first, it seemed like the perfect neighborhood. Quiet streets lined with freshly manicured lawns, neighbors who greeted you with a smile, and the soft hum of children's laughter drifting through the air. For Rachel and her family, moving into the sunny suburban enclave was supposed to be the start of something peaceful, a fresh chapter away from the chaos of the city. Rachel, a single mother of two, had always dreamed of this kind of life. She worked long hours as a freelance graphic designer, often taking calls late into the night, but during the day, she cherished the tranquility her new home offered. Her kids, Emma and Lucas, would play in the yard while she worked, and on weekends, they'd all take trips to the nearby park. The community was welcoming, and the local HOA, short for Homeowners Association, seemed like a minor, almost invisible presence. At first, the HOA's rules didn't seem too burdensome. They had a community pool, regular meetings, and an online forum to discuss matters that concerned everyone. But Rachel had never been the type to get involved in politics, especially not neighborhood politics. She thought if she kept to herself, everything would be fine. Then, just a month after moving in, she received a strange letter from the HOA, a notice that made her stomach twist when she read it. Unauthorized use of your private pool is a violation of the community agreement. Please cease immediately to avoid further action. Rachel stood frozen in her kitchen, staring at the letter. She didn't have any idea what they meant. Unauthorized use? She hadn't even had time to host a party, let alone break any rules. Her pool was her personal space, her little slice of peace where she could unwind after long days of work and take a break from the demands of motherhood. The letter made no sense. But what Rachel didn't know was that this was just the beginning. A simple misunderstanding, or so she thought, would soon escalate into a battle that would test her patience, her resolve, and even her sanity. Who was behind this? And what exactly was the HOA trying to punish her for? Rachel had no idea that she was about to face a neighbor who wasn't just controlling, but ruthlessly determined to enforce rules at any cost. And this wasn't just about a pool, it was about power. But how far would she have to go to take control back? It all started with a letter, but the real nightmare began when Rachel walked out into her backyard the next morning, only to see Karen, her next-door neighbor, smiling triumphantly from the edge of Rachel's private pool. At first, Rachel thought she must have misinterpreted the HOA's notice. Surely they didn't mean her pool. She had followed all the community guidelines, kept her yard pristine, and never violated a single rule. And as for the pool, well, it was an above-ground model, barely larger than a kiddie pool, but it was hers, and she wasn't aware of any restrictions on personal pools. But Karen was a different story. She'd lived in the neighborhood for years, long enough to have a reputation. Not a good one. The kind of neighbor who knew every rule, every regulation, and who loved to report anyone who so much as sniffed in the wrong direction. Rachel had learned this the hard way when she'd accidentally parked too close to the curb on her first week and received a passive-aggressive note on her car. It was Karen's handwriting, no doubt. At first, Rachel assumed it was a one-time thing. But when Karen showed up, strolling confidently by the pool with a margarita in hand, it became clear the HOA's warning wasn't a mistake. "Nice pool," Karen said, voice dripping with sweetness. but you might want to check the rules about what's considered personal use around here." Rachel's jaw tightened. She didn't even know how to respond. She'd barely exchanged more than pleasantries with Karen, but there she was, standing on Rachel's property as though she had some kind of right to be there. "What do you mean by that?" Rachel asked, her voice calm, despite the irritation boiling inside her. Karen, acting as if she were doing Rachel a favor, looked over her shoulder at the pool, then back at Rachel. "You're not supposed to be hosting guests here unless it's a community-approved event. The HOA has specific guidelines for private pools." Rachel blinked, her mind racing. She hadn't hosted anyone, certainly not any guests. But Karen, armed with her knowledge of every rule, was clearly looking for a way to twist the situation. Rachel nodded tightly, but before she could say anything, Karen turned on her heel and walked back to her house, without a word of goodbye. The moment she stepped inside her house, Rachel grabbed the notice from the HOA again, rereading it. There it was in black and white. "Unauthorized use of pool. Fines will be imposed if behavior continues." Her mind raced. What was going on? She had followed all the rules, wasn't? Her pool, her private property, her business? The next few days passed in a haze. Every time Rachel tried to take her kids outside to swim, Karen seemed to be lurking around the corner, casually, walking by with her dog. Rachel could feel Karen's eyes following her every move, silently judging. And then it happened. Another letter. "You have been issued a second fine of $150 for violating HOA rules related to unauthorized pool use. Failure to comply will result in further penalties. Please schedule a meeting with the board of directors." Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. A second fine? For what? She had barely used the pool, just a quick splash for her kids on a Sunday afternoon, a quiet moment she thought was private. But now, she was being told she was violating something she didn't even know existed. And to make matters worse, she was being summoned to a meeting with the HOA board. As Rachel sat down to draft an email asking for clarification, the doorbell rang. It was Karen again, standing on the porch, a smug smile playing at the edges of her lips. "Hi, Rachel," she said, her voice oozing with fake sweetness. "I thought I should let you know that the HOA is watching closely. It wouldn't hurt to follow the rules, right?" Rachel didn't even bother to hide her frustration this time. "Are you seriously here again, Karen? I'm getting tired of you making baseless accusations." Karen didn't flinch. "I'm just trying to help you, Rachel. I'm doing what's right for the neighborhood. You wouldn't want any more fines, would you?" Rachel's eyes narrowed. She could feel her blood pressure rising, but she forced herself to breathe. Karen was clearly enjoying this, feeding off Rachel's frustration. But Rachel wasn't going to let her win. "I'll handle it, Karen. Thanks for the advice." Rachel slammed the door shut, but the words still lingered. In her mind, you wouldn't want any more fines, would you? The HOA meeting came faster than Rachel anticipated. A few days later, she found herself sitting in a sterile conference room, surrounded by the board members who, at first glance, seemed like the definition of suburban civility. But the moment they began speaking, Rachel realized they were no better than Karen, just another group of people willing to enforce petty rules without a shred of common sense. One of the board members, Mr. Thompson, barely looked at her as he read from a clipboard. "Ms. Williams, it's come to our attention that you have been using your pool in violation of HOA policies. We've already issued 2 fines, and we're here today to discuss further action." Rachel's throat tightened. "But," she started, but Mr. Thompson raised his hand to silence her. "I understand that you may feel this is unfair," he said, his voice dry and emotionless. "But rules are rules. If you don't comply with our policies, we will have no choice but to take legal action." Rachel felt the walls close in. Legal action over a pool. It was absurd. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could get another word in, Karen walked into the room, a smug expression plastered across her face. It was like she was waiting for this moment, poised for victory. The room fell silent. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. Over the next week, things took a darker turn. As Rachel tried to get her bearings, the HOA escalated, sending her threatening letters warning of legal consequences. Each time she tried to reason with them, it felt like they were tightening their grip. But Karen, she wasn't satisfied with just following the rules. No, she was taking things further. She was now reporting Rachel for every minor infraction. The grass was a little too long on the lawn. Rachel got a warning. The garage door was left open too long. Another fine. It was harassment at its finest. Rachel could feel herself spiraling. She couldn't escape the suffocating pressure. Every time she stepped outside, there was Karen, ready to pounce. Every time she opened her mailbox, there was another letter from the HOA, another fine, another threat. It felt like she was losing control of her life. The breaking point came when Rachel's neighbor, Steve, dropped by one afternoon with a concerned look on his face. "Hey, Rachel," he said softly. "I just wanted to warn you. Karen's not stopping. The HOA's in her pocket. They've been talking about forcing you out of the community if you don't comply. I've seen them talking behind your back. You have to be careful." Rachel's stomach turned. Was this really happening? Were they going to push her out of her own home over this? She stood up abruptly, determination flooding her veins. No, not without a fight. And that was when it hit her. The real battle wasn't just about a pool. It was about standing up for herself and taking down Karen and the HOA along the way. But what could she do? She couldn't just sit back and accept this. She had to fight back. But would it be enough? The courtroom was packed with people. It wasn't a grand, dramatic scene like you'd see in the movies, but the atmosphere was tense, filled with anticipation. Rachel stood at the edge of the courtroom, the weight of the last few months pressing down on her shoulders. Every decision, every step she had taken had led to this moment. She wasn't just fighting for her pool anymore. She was fighting for her dignity, her family, and the right to live her life without being controlled by a self-serving HOA and a power-hungry neighbor. Her lawyer, an experienced and calm woman named Eleanor, stood by her side. Rachel couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for Elena's unwavering support. Without her, this entire battle might have fallen apart before it ever had a chance to begin. Elena had meticulously reviewed every document, every fine, and every email, and now they were ready to make their case. As Rachel looked across the courtroom, her gaze fell on Karen, sitting at the far end, her arms crossed in a defensive posture. The sight of her smug face made Rachel's blood boil, but this time, the anger was different. It wasn't the impotent rage of someone backed into a corner. It was the kind of rage that fueled determination, the kind of fury that made you want to fight until the very end. Karen's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with an air of superiority, spoke to the judge first. His words were rehearsed, clinical, designed to present the HOA's position as a necessary form of protection for the community. He spoke of bylaws, of code enforcement, and of the great lengths the HOA had gone to preserve the neighborhood's reputation. He even mentioned that Rachel's pool, though technically private, had violated community guidelines that she should have known about, despite the fact that they were so ambiguous that they could mean anything. Rachel's heart sank for a moment, but Elena squeezed her hand. "Don't worry," she whispered. "We've got them on the ropes." The judge, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense expression, nodded curtly. She glanced at Rachel, then at Karen and her lawyer. Rachel could see that the judge was trying to remain neutral, but she knew what this case boiled down to: abuse of power. When it was Rachel's turn to speak, she stood up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about sending a message, about standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced or pushed down by those who abused their power. With Elena's guidance, Rachel spoke clearly and passionately. She talked about the fine print in the HOA's rules, how the policies were vague and poorly enforced, how the HOA had weaponized their power against her in a way that was both unfair and illegal. She mentioned how Karen had used her position in the neighborhood to harass and intimidate her, how every small infraction was met with a fine or a threat. Rachel talked about the toll this had taken on her family, how it had affected her kids, and how it had made her feel like a prisoner in her own home. Rachel wasn't just telling a story. She was telling her story, the story of a woman pushed to her limits but never willing to break. When she finished, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Rachel looked around the room and saw the jury members leaning forward in their seats, some nodding, others taking notes. The judge's expression remained neutral, but there was something in the air, a subtle shift. Rachel had struck a chord. The defense lawyer was next. He tried to discredit Rachel's testimony, claiming that she was just a frustrated homeowner with an overactive imagination. He argued that the HOA was only doing its job, that the fines were justified, and that the guidelines were there for a reason. But Rachel knew it wasn't about the rules. It was about a neighbor who had taken those rules and twisted them to satisfy her own ego, her own need for control. And it was about an HOA that had become a tool for Karen's vendetta, rather than an organization that was supposed to protect the community. Rachel felt her pulse quicken as the final arguments were presented. The judge asked for a recess to deliberate. Rachel sat in silence with Elena, waiting for what felt like hours. She could feel the weight of everything on her chest. This wasn't just a case about a pool. It was about standing up against injustice. It was about taking a stand against the way some people, given power, could make life miserable for others. Rachel wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever felt bullied or powerless in the face of bureaucracy and petty authority. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, the judge returned. "The court has reviewed the evidence," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Ms. Williams, I find that the HOA acted in bad faith in this case. The guidelines presented to you were unclear, and the fines imposed were disproportionate to any alleged violations. Furthermore, the actions of your neighbor, Ms. Karen, appear to be driven by personal vendetta rather than legitimate concerns for community standards." Rachel held her breath. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The court orders the immediate removal of all fines and violations against Ms. Williams. Additionally, the HOA is hereby required to review its policies to ensure clarity and fairness. The court also recognizes the harassment caused by Ms. Karen, and as a result, she will be required to pay compensation for emotional distress. Rachel felt a wave of relief flood through her. She could hardly believe it. For the first time in months, she could breathe again. The weight that had been crushing her was lifting, piece by piece. Karen's face turned pale, her smug expression replaced with something darker, something that looked a lot like fear. As the judge banged her gavel, Rachel stood tall, her heart racing with adrenaline. She had done it. She had won. The injustice had been exposed, and now it would be corrected. In the days following the court decision, Rachel's life slowly started to return to normal. The fines were lifted, and the harassment stopped. Karen, despite her best efforts, became a pariah in the neighborhood. People started speaking out, telling Rachel that they had seen the unfairness, but had been too afraid to say anything. The HOA, facing public scrutiny, was forced to amend its policies, ensuring that homeowners had clear, fair guidelines and the right to challenge unjust fines. But for Rachel, The victory wasn't just about the pool. It was about reclaiming her life, her peace of mind, and her home. She realized that the battle wasn't just hers to fight. It was for anyone who had ever felt bullied or powerless in the face of authority. She had fought not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced by the whims of those in power. Looking back on it all, Rachel could hardly believe how far she had come. What had started as a petty dispute over a pool had turned into a full-fledged fight for justice. And in the end, it was a fight she had won. But there was one thing that Rachel would never forget, the moment she stood in that courtroom and realized that it wasn't just the rules she was fighting against. It was the abuse of power, the kind that could turn any neighborhood into a battleground. And in the end, it wasn't about winning. It was about standing up, finding your voice, and never letting anyone take away what was rightfully yours. As Rachel stood in her backyard that evening, watching her kids.